Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sweet and Bitter, a standalone podcast by the Academy in anticipation and in preparation for this year's Tu Bishvat. The aim of the podcast is to enable you to run your own Tu Bishvat Seder using our Haggadah, which we've prepared for this year, and we've prepared something slightly different. And when we began this process, we asked, why is this Tu Bishvat different from all other Tu Bishvats? And the answer is twofold. Firstly, for those of you who have not run a Tu Bishvat Seder, this is not Pesach. So that's the first difference. There are some similarities to the Pesach Seder, 4 cups of wine. However, there are major differences, both in the purpose and in the process. The second major difference, and that is the reason we have called this podcast and this process Sweet and Bitter, is because, of course, this year, this Tu Bishvat is both a sweet time and a very bitter one. We are going through a process of the freeing of hostages, people coming out of unthinkable hundreds of days in cages underground, gaining freedom. It is a tremendously liberating time, but on the other hand, it is, of course, still very, very bitter. And those are ideas that hopefully we'll be able to explore in the podcast. Tu Bishvat, as an organic, botanical, living celebration, perhaps is more suited to help us deal with and develop the tools to deal with what we're going through, holding two opposite emotions, the sweetness and the bitterness, the gratitude and the sorrow, together in tension in a healthy way. We hope you enjoy. And thank you for joining us.
Great, Rav Ramon. Well, thank you for that introduction. And Tu Bishvat is obviously my favorite Chag. Although let's clarify here and say that it's not necessarily a Chag. So everyone needs to know this. So where really did this come from? Let's take a look. Let's open our Tu Bishvat Haggadot that we have here. And take a look on your first page. What you'll see is that we've given you a little bit of an introduction. We've also given you a little bit of background, which I'm just going to mention very briefly, but of course you can read more details inside. Tu Bishvat is what we could really call, as you said, the organic, the evolving type of time space that we have, which is the 15th of Shvat. So let's take a look in our Haggadot at a little bit of the background to Tu Bishvat. The original Tu Bishvat is in fact a tax deadline, which is a cut-off moment if you had fruit trees. You were a farmer with fruit trees. This was the moment that you cut off the fruit that had grown the year before, and the fruit that was going to grow the next year. This moment was when you said, okay, all the fruit that had grown up until this point, you now gave some of that as ma'aser, as a tenth, and then you counted from then on. A very practical, very economic moment. What happens after that, though, is that it evolves. When we are exiled from the land, it becomes a moment when people look back in nostalgia at the fruits of the land, at how beautiful the land was. And then there's a major change, which is in the 16th century, with the rise of the Kabbalah, the Arizal, who decides that this is a moment when we eat fruit and raise ourselves up spiritually into another dimension. And that really begins this idea of having different fruits and having wine, echoing really what happens in the Haggadah. So we're going to leave you to read the rest of this. It evolves eventually into something else, which is the planting of trees, we'll mention at the end. But really, for the moment, the Haggadah itself, or the Seder itself, is something that takes very spiritual, very physical things and raises it into something very spiritual. And let's take a look how that works. We've left you a couple of stories to read, but then we will begin with preparing the Seder. So what you'll see in front of us here is that we have a few things ready. We've given you a list of all the key ingredients. So what you'll need is white wine and red wine. You'll need then these various fruits that we're going to go through as we go along. Of course, you don't have to use the ones that we're using. You can use others. The ideal is to use fruits from the land of Israel, the 7 special fruits that we talk about. That's what you're going to be used. And then, of course, we're going to end with some Woolies spices. So, shall we begin?
If you turn to page 4 in your Haggadah, in the Tu Bishvat Haggadah, that is where the actual Seder begins. The original Seder is unbelievably spiritually dense and pregnant with Kabbalistic ideas. We have adapted that for this Haggadah, but we've also added in some things that I think and that we think are relevant to the period in which we're going through. So the first thing we're going to do is pour ourselves a glass each of pure white grape juice or wine, and I'll start with that. Here we go. We haven't received any sponsorship for these wines. We're still trying. Those of you who watch our regular podcast, Two Jews and a Scotch, will know that that podcast is essentially buttressed by Scotch. It just so happens that we're here at 9 o'clock in the morning recording alcoholic-fueled podcasts around Jewish topics, but that has nothing to do with our apparent enthusiasm for recording these things. So, on page 4 at the top, the first word we're going to deal with is winter. And the 4 stages of the Haggadah parallel the 4 seasons. First one is winter. And we'll start off by making a bracha on the white wine. If you have all the other foods in front of you and you have mizonot, like crackers or bread, just make sure to cover those first, like we do on Shabbat, before you say the bracha. Right, let's go. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen.
Amen.
Amen. Yum.
So why do we have white wine, Rav Ramon?
It tastes very nice.
At 9 o'clock in the morning.
At 9 o'clock in the morning. Listen, I went for a great run this morning. I haven't eaten breakfast. I don't know how long I'm going to stay sober for. So I would suggest this is going to be a fairly short podcast. Don't worry. Great question. Why white wine? So if we look in our Haggadah, go for it, ILana. What does it say?
Right. So remember, for those of us who are in the southern hemisphere, things are a little upside down. In the northern hemisphere, this is winter. We're getting towards the end of winter, and specifically in places like Europe, Israel, not to the same extent. White is the color. There is no color in the world. It's covered in snow, right? Especially in America or in northern Europe. There is no color. There seems to be no life in the world itself. And that is really where we start. We start in the world of winter, where nothing seems to be alive. And yet, we need to understand that beneath this, the sap is beginning to rise in the trees. But we can't see that happening. So this gets echoed in the white of the wine, yellow, white of the wine, which has no color, and refers to then, in terms of the Kabbalistic idea, as olam, what we call olam ha'asiyah. It's called the world of action, but what it really means is this idea of potential. This is not action in itself, but the potential of action that lies beneath the snow. That's really what's happening right here now.
So the next foods that we'll eat are foods that have a shell, which is exactly this idea. On the outside, it's hard, but you have to be able to see to the potential within. And of course, that's wine, because a grape has a little bit of a skin, and then you've got the flesh. The wine, though, is not really in the grape. It's just in potential. That's why we begin with wine. And the first, then, food we'll have will be wheat. So we've got wheat crackers over here. And then we've got some nuts, which have outer hard shells, which we'll have as well. And we've got one particular nut, the almond, which is highly praised in the land of Israel and in the Tanakh. Right, you ready?
Right, so the wheat being, of course, originally, it has a kernel around it. And then, of course, we take that out, and it is the potential that is within the wheat that becomes bread, which, of course, really speaks to the idea of wine. Same thing. And, of course, it works as a fruit of Israel, as well as, of course, the first bracha that one should make.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei minei mizonot.
Yum. You may, by the way, add anything you like onto the crackers so that they're not dry.
We should have actually used matzah for this. We should have used
matzah.
Right?
But that would have been confusing, I think. However, feel free to use hummus as another beautiful staple of the land of Israel and the Middle East in order to make that beautiful. And then, of course, we have the almonds or pistachios, things that have a cover that covers the potential that is within. And that would be a borei pri ha'etz. So let's begin with that, and then we will have done most of our things. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri ha'etz. And we're going to crunch loudly into the microphones.
Don't forget to lean to the left.
So on that, let's discuss whether there should not be another fruit or have another vegetable involved here.
And something that ILana and I pondered very deeply in the run-up preparation for this Tu Bishvat Seder, I've been mentally having to change. Every time I say it in my head, I'm saying Tisha B'Av Seder. It's not coming up as naturally out of my head as Tu Bishvat Seder. And I think it really reflects the period in which we find ourselves. And the Jewish people have been through a hell over the past year and a half, even further. And we've been through a hell, some of which has been internally inflicted, tremendous internal divisions, then October 7th, then hostages, then war, then casualties, people not coming home, hostages being returned, not being returned. And when we thought about this, the question arose, well, why is there no bitter herb in this Seder? Now, in a Pesach Seder, we are celebrating our redemption, but at the same time, we do have the bitter herbs because it was bitter. And here we are in the midst of the Tu Bishvat Seder, and the Kabbalists particularly instituted this with all of its minutiae, because their ultimate belief was that when we perform these small mitzvot, we take maaser, we make a bracha, we get the fruit of the land, that those small deeds eventually culminate cosmically in a redemption. And when they began this 500-600 years ago, can you imagine how bizarre it must have seemed? Half of them were the descendants of people who had been exiled from Spain in the Great Expulsion in 1492. They'd wandered the earth looking for refuge, and they land up in Tzfat. And here they are sitting around a table eating pistachios and saying, this will bring the redemption. And people must have thought, no, that's madness. But that is what happened. Their settlement in the land encouraged other people, and then other people, and then other people. Then 500 years later, you'll end up with a wave and eventually a state. So we don't discount this. At the same time, we see the fruits of the redemption growing before us, fruits that now grown in the land of Israel. As the Gemara tells us, there is no greater revealed sign that the Messiah is coming than the fruits of the land are in such abundance. At the same time, it has been bitter. So we leave it up to you, the participant, to reflect on this. Do you have a bitter fruit at this year's Tu Bishvat Seder? Do you have a bitter herb? Do you have a fruit that is just not yet ripe? So it's getting there, but an unripe fruit is a bit bitter. And as you eat that, maybe we can reflect on the period that we're going through, because it is bitter, and what we could do in the spirit of those Kabbalists, very small deeds that changed a lot over a long period of time, how we can treat our fellows differently, how Am Yisrael can treat each other differently, so that we move out of the winter and perhaps into the spring. So we're going to use some lettuce. So it's not romaine lettuce. It's not bitter lettuce, and maybe that's something you want to think about, or a fruit maybe that's not yet ripe.
So on that, and thinking of the fact that redemption has not entirely come, and we do not have all our hostages,
yep,
we will make the bracha. Crunching into the mic. All right, so that brings us now to the next cup of wine and the next world and the next season.
It's on page 6.
Which is going to be on page 6. I want to mention that unlike Pesach, you do not have to have a full cup of wine when you're drinking this, unless you really want to. But now what we do is we take the red wine and we add a splash into our white wine.
We're going to do something slightly different, we suggest, for this, in that you make sure, and this is something we do at the Pesach Seder, that you pour someone else's glass on this particular season, and we'll explain a bit why later.
All right.
A splash.
A splash.
Thank you for my splash.
Just a splash.
How come you've got more wine left?
I'm holding back. So what you'll notice now is that the white wine, which had no color, we now add a dash of color, because that's what spring is. Spring is now the entrance of color and life into the world. It's very obvious that that's what it is. And now this is what we call the world of formation, which is when we take the raw materials and transform them actually, not potentially, but actually into something else. The fruit that gets used for this is any fruit that has a soft outside with a seed inside. So instead of the klipa, the shell being on the outside, we're now saying the hard thing that we don't eat, though, the seed that we don't eat, is inside, but it is a seed. That means it is not something we throw away, but in fact we will use and we will plant. So it's already going up a level.
Right. You want a date?
Let's have a date, which of course is a fruit from the land of Israel.
Right. We've already said the bracha on these.
Right.
So enjoy.
And would you like to discuss why we poured into each other's cups?
Oh, you can.
Okay. The idea when we do it on Pesach, of course, is because we're giving one to the other.
Everyone's a king. Everyone's a queen. Everyone gets
So
served.
you are served. Sorry, you're right. That's what we want to say now, though. What we want to say now is that perhaps something that we know was missing before October 7th was a sense of the other, a sense of unity, a sense of the fact that each other is created in the image of God and has something of worth, even if we may not agree. So here...
Especially if we don't agree.
And in fact, especially if we don't agree. So here, what we want to say is, how do we reach out to someone who maybe we don't agree with? Now, truth is that Rav Ramon and I sometimes agree and sometimes we don't. But by pouring into each other's glasses, we are seeing the other and we are expecting and wanting to be able to discuss and to talk and to see the other's point of view.
Chaim.
L'chaim. On that note.
Great. I love Rashi. Also, I'm punting it, but we're not getting anything back from them. Don't worry. Divine.
Let's go on to the to the next.
The third world is summer. And of course, as we pour ourselves now, or pour each other, we're going to be having half red and half white. So the glass is going to be a lot redder than it has been so far. And it's interesting how we relate from the Torah perspective to the season of summer. You know, for many people, summer is this idealized time of liberty and sun and freedom. But in Israel, actually, summer can be, and particularly in the Middle East, can be a very harsh time. We know that at the height of summer is, of course, our greatest day of mourning, the Tisha B'Av. Nearly said Tu Bishvat, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. And what we thought we'd reflect on here, and if you look on page 8 and 9 in your Haggadah, that's where we've got this. What we thought of reflecting on here is at the time of tremendous judgment, at the time of real harsh summer sun beating down on us, the glare of the world which we have undergone over the past year, something that happened just a week or so ago really resonated very powerfully with us. So one of the hostages that was released was Gadi Moses, and he was released in those very challenging circumstances of thousands and thousands of people and thousands of terrorists around him. And as he walked through, he had this faint smile on his face. And it went viral throughout Israel and the Jewish people, because people looked at this and went, wow, how is he doing that? What is the core of his strength? What is the secret sauce? And this really begged the question, and I think it's a great point to actually start and discuss a bit amongst yourselves, and we'll do a bit of it, is what is the source of our eternity? And we know Mark Twain, in his very famous paragraph, everyone quotes. They don't quote the whole thing. It's not all that complimentary of our people. But he said, what is the secret to our immortality? And here you have 80-year-old Gadi Moses, who had been in a cage underground for over 400 days, starved, suffering from malnutrition, hadn't seen the light. And here he was with serenity walking through. And something that we can think about is that we're going to survive this, like they did. I had a really interesting discussion with someone, which really bothered me, but it was profound. Someone turned to me and said to me, after everything these people have been through, is it better that they are freed? Imagine having to deal with the rest of their lives with all of these scars and the trauma. I mean, it's PTSD.
They truly are survivors.
And that's exactly what I said. But they like,
in both senses.
Yes, they like. Do we not say similar things about Holocaust survivors, where they do have PTSD for the rest of their lives? They are waking up in the middle of the night screaming with nightmares, but they're an incredible source of strength. Incredible. Those people who've come with me to Poland and seen this firsthand, like the energy, the strength that these people have. People who've been blessed to be around people like Ella Blumenthal, and just to see that strength. It's a complicated strength, but my golly, I think that's perhaps the answer. With that type of person around you as a role model, you survive. I mean, you had a very interesting anecdote from another place where you were the other day. Maybe you can share it with people.
Yes. It's an interesting thing because we're so wrapped up, I guess, in our lives and what we're going through. And when you speak to people who are not part of this, they're actually gobsmacked. After I was sitting there watching, in fact, the freeing of Arbel Yehud, and I was muttering, to be honest, and feeling quite stressed about it, obviously. And two of my colleagues turned to me and said, what's going on? Non-Jewish colleagues asked me what was going on. I said, well, do you really want to know? And then we began this conversation, and I was explaining to them exactly what was going on in terms of the hostages, etc. And after I'd finished describing what they had gone through, and that despite all, people still wanted to kill us, and that, they turned to me and they said, we don't know how you live. We don't know how you continue every day with this burden on you. And my first sort of flippant thing to say, my reply was, well, we've been practicing for 2,000 years. But as we discussed, the point is, it's not about just practicing, but it was, well, okay, it's rising above. It's what's the bigger picture.
And I think this Tu Bishvat Seder is exactly that to a large extent, where you can sit 500-600 years ago, which is maybe a decade or a couple of decades after being expelled from Spain, losing the golden age of Spanish Jewry, hundreds of thousands of Jews, 600-700 years of Jewish community gone literally in 3 months.
Exactly.
And then what do? You go and you eat your pistachio nuts. And there's that very famous saying, what's every Jewish festival about? They try to kill us. We survived. Let's eat.
Exactly. So we've made this into that too.
That's where we are.
Exactly.
So, l'chaim.
And on that, l'chaim, to life. And in fact, that's the world of summer, by the way, because the world of summer is full season giving of fruit, although not that last moment of giving of fruit, but it is a moment when we say we use what we'll use here is a fruit that is all edible. So we've got seedless grapes, actually, for this, even though, of course, grapes often have seeds in it. But in this case, that's what we've got. And they look very, very good. Because what's the idea behind it is that at this moment in the world, there is full connection between ourselves and the world. Whereas before we were covered by a klipa, then in the next moment there's still something inside us that is holding back from totally connecting in the world. This time, in summer, we are at this moment where we embrace the good in it without fear. Totally. And that's a moment, I think, that is our bravery and that allows us to carry on, despite the bitter fruit that might be at the table with us.
Grapes are beautiful. I think it's also something we discussed. If those of you who want to maybe look a little bit further into it in Rav Soloveitchik's amazing book, The Emergence of Ethical Man. But it's a hard read. But this is one of the things he speaks about, that the break between Adam and Eve was not just a break between them and Hashem, but it was also a break between the healthy relationship with nature, and that this is a regaining of that healthy relationship.
Right.
Okay, and the final season that we head into then is in the Haggadah is autumn.
I'm sorry, struggling to finish my course, but that's fine.
I'm just pouring less.
You're just pouring. So now the wine that we have is pure red. So there should be, ideally, no white left in it. ILana's not doing that well on it, but Rav Ramon is. This is the pure red season of autumn. And of course, specifically, you'll find in North America and in Europe. Africa, it's a little different, but we're talking about the leaves on the trees that are red. We're talking about the abundance of the last harvest. John Keats, one of my favorite poems, and we've given it to you here, Ode to Autumn, says it is the season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch-eaved runs. This is the moment, and in fact in Africa as well, where many trees and plants put out their berries and their fruit because winter is coming. And so it's this moment of fantastic abundance, even though we might have thought, no, that was summer. In fact, it's actually autumn. So what is that we learn from that for ourselves, of course, is that this is almost beyond the physical. We understand physicality up until summer. Now this is a moment that says actually the picture is bigger, there's a longer picture. And we're now going to look at things further, understanding that bad times happen, but we have been given the resources to get through them. And one of the major resources, though, and it's interesting, is that in this case we do not eat any fruit at this point. But in fact, we take ourselves to the highest of senses. If you'd like to discuss it.
I have no idea what I'm supposed to say now.
Right. So I'll carry on, because I'm on a roll. Is that now what we do is we take a spice and we make a bracha on smell. And smell, we know, is it's a very powerful sense, in which there is no physicality, but if you think about it, when you smell something, it jogs your memory in a way that taste doesn't and in a way that vision doesn't. So it's something that's beyond. We are no longer in the physical world. We are now in the spiritual world with all the power that holds. So on that, we would make a bracha. And the bracha is going to be borei minei v'samim. Although if you happen to have plants, for example, mint or herbs from your garden, then you would use a different bracha, and that is, I think, barei atzvei basamim, if I'm not mistaken, or
isvei
basamim. There's a couple of different options. Please refer to your local siddur for that. And that's what we're going to do on this. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei basamim.
Amen.
This is what we call the totally spiritual world.
This thing, you can't pretend because the thing is closed. Like, we're going to open it.
Right.
I
was kind of hoping he wouldn't say that.
There you go.
Right. That's better.
It's better. You could smell a bit, but, it wasn't the real deal. I think as we finally head out towards the end of our of our Seder, the Chaim, for our last glass of wine.
For our last glass.
Are you driving me home? Good. As we head towards the end of the Seder, focusing the period in which we find ourselves, we just cast our minds back over the past 2,500 years. We start out in a period when we're in our land, we're independent, the abundance of fruit, the bounty is there. It's something we say every day in Shema, where we're in this relationship with nature and with Hashem. Hashem sends the rains in their time. By the way, there's a real drought at the moment in Israel. And the coming of the rains heralds the resurgence and the rebirth of a healthy relationship with Hashem and with nature. And then we lose our land. And the question that we have to deal with is, how do we retain this organic sense of rebirth, reflowering, and this belief that we will take root once again in our land, both physically but also spiritually? If we think of the types of life that we occupied outside of the land, sparse growth, we like felt, this beaten down grass subsisting in the diaspora, and we wonder to ourselves, when are we going to once again grow into large strapping trees, the cedars, the brosh, all of those beautiful trees of the Tanakh, and of course not just the ILana Srak, the trees which have no fruit, but the fruit trees. And here we are, 2,500 years later, when we have the full bounty before us, and we might have thought that it would end on summer. That's where many of us thought. That's it. You get back in 1948, and then 1967, we have Jerusalem again, and we're just on the up and up. The trees are growing higher and higher. But as Rav Amital, my late Rosh Hashiva, taught in his book, Amalot Mima Makim, written just after the Yom Kippur War, 1973, that is not necessarily the way that growth happens. Growth does go in cycles. It's not an ever-ending upward motion. There's growth, and then there's autumn as well. And there's no doubt that, and we were literally in 2023, on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, about to launch a series on the Yom Kippur War. And then, of course, the Yom Kippur War is predicated upon how did they surprise us? Where was the intelligence? And then a few days later, we were hit by October 7th, and the same discussions happen. And it seems that unending upward growth has been halted. We might have thought, is this the end? But no, as we see here, we're now heading into autumn. There is a time of this incredible abundance, but what is it for? It's gathering our strength, because we are going to be challenged with tough days ahead. We need to gather that strength. We're going to celebrate, we're going to eat the fruit, but we also need to gather that strength.
We do need to gather that strength. And just to add one thing, which is the final, or I don't know if it's the final, but certainly the next iteration of this Chag, of this day, is really the one that begins in the 1900s, where a principal of a high school, Yavetz, just gone blank on his first name, decides to bring his students together to plant trees in the land of Israel. They're in the land of Israel. We know that at that time, the land of Israel was either marsh or desert, and he decides to start planting trees. And this custom now of planting trees in the desert or anywhere in Israel really becomes the main thing of the Jewish National Fund, plus, of course, just generally. And really, if you think about it, that's what planting a tree is all about, because planting a tree, you don't know. You don't know if a drought will happen, or if a flood will happen, or if you'll forget to water it, or whatever the case may be.
Or if you'll ever get any of the fruit.
Or if you'll ever get any of the fruit. You won't see it. The famous story of Choni, who sees an old man planting a carob tree, a carob sapling, and he says, "What are you planting?" And the old man says, "I'm planting a carob," and he says, "But that's going to take 70 years before it brings you fruit. Why are you doing that? What for? You're never going to see the fruit." And the old man says to Choni, "I came into a world filled with carob trees. I intend that it stays like that. I will plant a tree even if I don't see the fruit." And so I think that moment of hope, despite all, that's the final lesson of autumn. And that's the lesson of planting your tree. So definitely we would encourage you to plant a tree. and to continue that custom, which is, of course, the ultimate message of hope. The Haggadah ends, or the Seder ends, with a prayer for the tikkun of fruit, a moment where we say Lashana. You could say Lashana haba, B'Yerushalayim haBenuya, but we can also say Lashana tova uvracha pri utnuva. May the year be fruitful and blessed.
Right.
And it is a beautiful, beautiful blessing. And then, of course, we say at the end, we won't say it necessarily because I don't know that I've had enough. So we might have to say it afterwards. But,
Or just eat more.
Or we could just eat more. But, of course, a blessing on everything that you have eaten, ala mechia, and of course on the wine as well. So, and that really would end your Seder. And we hope that you have enjoyed.
Thank you for joining us.